So tonight we are at the midpoint of discussing the Jesus of tradition. Again, the fourth part of the fourfold Christological paradigm, the Jesus of the experience of the church, the risen Christ, the Christus praesens, the historical, so-called historical Jesus, the textual Jesus. Jesus is the apostolic writers, or the writers of that period understood Jesus, and then the Jesus now of the tradition, how Jesus has been understood historically. What I want to suggest to you tonight is that we engage in the purification of worldviews, because there's nothing more important than constantly refining the underlying assumptions that undergird your worldview, or mine, or anyone's. Bultmann is perhaps the greatest known proponent for the purification of worldviews in the 20th century with his demythologizing program. And his argument that because the New Testament writers held to a basic, three-story, three-tiered universe, heaven and then earth and then hell underneath, and because people believed in angels and demons, and people believed in miracles and magic and these kinds of things, and we know that to no longer be true. For Bultmann, what needed to be demythologized in the New Testament was the so-called supernatural or miraculous. That was to be stripped away. Then along came Jacques Derrida, who took the problem of demythologizing and applied it to philosophy. And what Derrida was able to do was to show that no matter how much you want to talk about myth, you're always going to end up having a logos slip in the discourse and screw it up. And the same thing is vice versa. The more you try to speak about logos, that is discourse, the more you're gonna have mythologizing slip in there. And that's the end of philosophy. It's the absolute end of philosophy with Jacques Derrida. There is no more philosophy. Abstract, metaphysical philosophy is gone. If Martin Heidegger could come along in the early 20th century and build the coffin of philosophy, it's Derrida who puts the nails in and seals it shut. But then there is a third demythologization that takes place in the 20th century, and that's with René Girard. But unlike Bultmann, he's not looking to demythologize the worldview of the New Testament writers. And like Derrida, Girard is looking to demythologize human discourse. And he does it by demythologizing the category of evil, or as he prefers to put it, demystifies, takes the mystery out of the category of evil. It is the combination, I think, of these three demythologizing programs that give us now the impetus and, in a sense, the freedom to move forward in the kind of trajectory I want to spell out for you tonight. And that's simply this. No matter how hard you try to rethink Christian theology, you will not be able to do it until you rethink your anthropology. Your theology will not change until your anthropology changes, because theology is nothing more than projection. And if we are going to project, we need to be able to project the anthropology that is given to us in the Gospels. Again, referencing that dictum of Simone Weil. In the Gospels, there is a theory of the human being. How did we get in the mess we're in, my friends? Well, as we observed a few weeks ago, part of it is that when we recite these larger ecumenical creeds, we've entirely omitted the life of Jesus. We go straight from his virgin birth to his being tortured by Pontius Pilate, crucified, dead, buried, and then raised again. There is nothing in the creed, nothing in the affirmation that is made in front of the assembly on a Sunday morning that says this is the content of the life that I follow. That used to be presupposed in the catechetical period. But the catechetical period and the coming of the creed are, in a sense, incongruent, because the coming of the creed is now about mass audiences adopting this Christian faith belief system, whereas the catechumenate was about raising disciples, creating followers. Okay, so in a sense, the end of the one is the beginning of the other. The early fathers, particularly Justin Martyr, are going to confuse logos and myth in their attempt to show that the Christian gospel is not suspect philosophically, to show that there's a congruence with this message of the gospel and the message of Hellenistic thinking in general. Okay? One of the first to do this, and most successfully, and the one that's certainly going to be copied, is Philo of Alexandria. One of the things Philo does, he's a contemporary of Jesus and Paul the Apostle, mostly Paul. One of the things Philo's going to do in his works is show that Moses, who lived, 900 years before Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, Moses, in his writings, the Torah, and then the other Jewish writings, these influenced Greek philosophy. This is going to be Philo's argument. They're older, and so there's going to be this Jewish influence on Greek philosophy. And of course, we know now that when we go back and look at the literature of this Second Temple period, it's actually quite the other way around, okay? It's Hellenism influencing Judaism and reactions to it across the board. But Philo is trying to do something here. He's trying to show the antiquity of Moses and the wisdom of Moses and the Torah. These are all now going to influence Greek philosophy, so that by the time we get to a thinker like Justin Martyr and the other apologists like Athenagoras in the 2nd century, what we have is the attempt to show that the logos of Greek philosophy, that is the Heraclitan logos, is the same as the logos of the fourth gospel or the early Christological tradition, which makes more sense because Justin Martyr doesn't appear to cite the fourth gospel. But he is the one that is going to bring in this Greek concept of the logoi spermatikoi, the logos sperm that each one of us gets a little drip of, thankfully, and that is what makes us human. And that little divine piece in us connects with the divine piece out of which it comes. This is very, very Hellenistic. It's very, very Gnostic as well. The little piece within us, whether you want to call it pneuma or spirit, whether you want to call it nous or mind, whatever, there's this little piece that connects up with the divine nous or the divine pneuma, and it's that little piece which gets redeemed, because it's certainly not going to be the soma, the body, the physical body, that gets redeemed. By confusing logos and mythos, logos and myth, revelation is covered up, and anthropology becomes misdirected desire for divinity or transcendence. And this is what we see in the fathers. The human species is that species which has a misdirected desire for transcendence. We can see this now, especially as we move into Augustine. And then, of course, I think you can find it in the Eastern Fathers as well. You can see it certainly in Maximus Confessor. The problem here is what's known as faculty psychology. Faculty psychology assumes that each of the parts of our psyche are independent of one another. So, for example, it has been assumed, literally assumed for close to 2,000 years, that human emotion and human reason are two different things. This was the error that Descartes made. We now know from the research that's been done that there is rationale in emotion and there is emotion in reason. The two cannot be separated. We used to speak of the mind-body dualism. Now there seems to be a larger general consensus that while we have brains, the mind is different than the brain, and the mind is larger than the brain. And we can make these connections that we weren't able to make before. The problem with faculty psychology in all of this, my friends, is that what ends up happening in the early church is Jesus gets dissected in terms of which parts of him are human and which parts of him are divine. And so for some writers and some thinkers, the different parts of Jesus are going to be divine. But very rarely is it ever the soma, the body. It's almost always the nous, the mind. That is, in the early church, the inability of the early fathers to reckon with the kind of Pauline statement that Jesus took on sinful flesh. That is, Jesus was different than us. He didn't sin. We sin. He didn't sin. Therefore, something of his was different. There are those in the early church and later in the Anabaptist movement that argued Jesus' flesh came from heaven. Then there are those who argued that it is his mind that is divine. There are those who contended it was his spirit and only his spirit that was divine, the Gnostics, for example. But in every single case, what we end up creating is a Jesus who is less and less like us. Any time we seek to exclude from his frame of reference that which we know to be true about ourselves, we are going to turn him into that which he is not. The problem of faculty psychology lies in assuming that certain parts of the human being need to be redeemed and other parts don't. There is the further problem of the ego. This is the psychological, we're looking at the psychological approach to the philosophical question of the relation of the one to the many. What's the relation of the one to the many? The king to the people, that which is unique to copies. What's the relation of one God to many gods? I mean, this is the question. The ego is the problem of the relation of the one to the many when it is assumed that the ego, that is the thinking consciousness, this thing here, is that which makes us human. We will find in the West that the problem of human consciousness is the sin problem. And you find that over and over again from Augustine, from Irenaeus, all the way through Calvin into your modern neo-reform movements, Roman Catholicism. All these movements have, everything is about the redemption of this ego consciousness, and as though that was the gospel. The problem of Jesus' divinization and the early church's inability to develop an anthropological model, a way of viewing the human being outside of the framework of Platonic categories, which were dualistic in character and separated soma from suke, from pneuma, from nous. These are all distinct. And the problem of the relation of the one to the many doesn't solve it, but the further divinization of Jesus, the further he's removed from humanity, the more his humanness is stripped away. He becomes elevated and exalted in the prayers and the liturgy of the church. And I've referenced this book before, The Place of Christ in Liturgical Prayer by Jungmann, who's able to demonstrate through 4 centuries how Jesus becomes so exalted, so divine, that we can no longer relate to him. So there's a gap now, and this gap has to be filled. And in the 4th century, as the humanity of Jesus begins to drop away, as the arguments around the divinity of Jesus begin to escalate, there will develop a need to talk about the human and salvation at the same time. But it can't be done in terms of Christ. It has to be done in terms of the development of the cult of the saints. That is, the church, because it was unable to talk about the human character of Jesus, developed its own set of human beings that it could talk about, those that it knew or they were related to by tradition. And it's this problematic that exists all through the history of Christendom. We have not, since the apostolic writers, the apostles, the original apostles that touched Jesus, we have not been able to develop an anthropology that does anything for us. And it's certainly, our gospel is far more bereft because we had not been able to develop an anthropology that matched the kind of soteriology or divine salvation that was indeed wrought by Jesus at the cross. In other words, I don't reject metaphysics as such. I'm not rejecting Platonism to reject Platonism. I'm saying there are good arguments for rejecting Platonism, but I don't reject it because of what it is. This has already been done, as I pointed out, in the 20th century, over and over and over again. This Platonic dualism has been challenged and is crashing. We're experiencing a major piece of that crash in the decline of Western civilization right now and the rise of the East geopolitically. We're at the end of a phase, okay? What I reject is not Platonic metaphysics, but Platonic anthropology, because there isn't any. It doesn't work. Once anthropology is reframed, metaphysical problems disappear. And that's why I've chosen, out of the various contemporary anthropologies that are out there, to adopt an anthropological model that I recognize is just that. It's a model that's able to take into account all kinds of data from all kinds of other anthropological models. And that's what makes it the strongest anthropological model for me, and that's the mimetic theoretical or mimetic realism model of anthropology. The things that are important for me in this model and that I think are important to stress are primarily this newer anthropological model moves us from the frame of things, mind, body, soul, spirit, to relationships. That is, our understanding of ourselves is to be perceived less as things in ourselves and more as things between us, things that exist between us, the relationships that we have. So it's the relationality, not the Cartesian thingness of a thing or the Kantian thingness of a thing that's important. It's the relationships that are important. And in the anthropology, the anthropological theory of the Gospels, which we're going to get to over the next 2 weeks, this Christo-anthropology in the Gospels is dominated by a corporate figure, a character of corporate solidarity, of one who stands in place of the many. And that's the ho huios tu anthropou, the Son of Man. And Jesus' use of that title to bring together this whole business of the relationship of the one to the many, and to be able to show us that it is these relationships that are redeemed. Not us, but our relationships are redeemed. And we're going to be talking a lot about that in the next 2 weeks. In addition to that, the mimetic apology brings with it, I think, something very key, and that is the phenomenon of imitation. We don't learn to imitate and then imitate, a la Fowler and other child developmentalists. No, we're imitating out of the womb. There's just too much empirical research that's been done in the last 20 years on this. Oh shoot, I forget Dr. Andrew's last name. He has a video of babies imitating his facial expressions 18 minutes out of the womb. We are born Xerox copy machine, folks. That's what we do. We imitate. And we're aware that we do this because we do it. Sorry, folks are dropping and coming back. I'm having to manage that too. The reason I find this imitation theme so fascinating is that if you take the Great Creed of Nicaea and you have this language now, and this language says, God of God, light of light, true God of true God, begotten, not made. You have all these questions relating to being and everything else. It's not going to make any sense to you. Doesn't make any sense to me. But if instead I'm able to talk about Jesus as the one who does the Father's will, the one who hears the Father and repeats what the Father says, the one who sees what the Father's doing and imitates it, now I have Jesus as this apprentice, Jesus as the Father's apprentice. And so, when we saw prior to videotaping the lecture, we watched that video called The Dancing Guy. In that video, the shirtless guy is the Heavenly Father. Jesus is the first follower. You with me on this? In other words, my tendency when I first saw that video was to think of Jesus as the shirtless guy. And then the Apostle Paul was the first follower. And others came along, and eventually I came along, and you came along, and we're all out there dancing. It's not that way. The Father is the shirtless character. The first follower, that's Jesus. And like this guy says, he turns it into a movement by acknowledging his first followers as equals. And he says this in the gospel tradition, I no longer call you servants. I call you friends. That kind of equality is built in to this Christological imitation. It's a servant-oriented imitation. It is not a slavish copying of Jesus. It's not some kind of an attempt to impose a rule or a law upon the Christian life. It's not an Anabaptist legalism. It is indeed a real freedom to imitate the Son in absolute freedom, as everybody was doing on that dancing pitch. Everybody was doing their own thing, but they were all doing their own thing following the inspiration of one. And they were a body in that sense. In his book, Imitating Jesus, Richard Burridge says this: the central argument of this book arises from the fact that ancient biographies held together both words and deeds in portraying their central subjects. And then he goes on to note that many ancient lives, Lives, were composed to provide a paradigm for others to follow to become better people. He says, in fact, it's not just the biographical hypothesis which requires us to take this aspect of Jesus' example in the Gospels into consideration. The Jews, now don't laugh too hard on this because this gets a little ribald, but it's true and it's funny. The Jews believed that a teacher's example was as important as his words. Thus, in the absence of a ruling by a legal authority, it was permissible to report his actions and to deduce from them what his legal position would be on the matter. This was known as ma'aseh, precedent. It happened that Rabbi X did such and such. From this master's actions, something of the Torah would be learned. Well, of course, now you have the story of the pupil that follows the rabbi into the outhouse to see how he does his duty so that he can copy him. And then there's the story of Rabbi Kahana hid under his master's bed and was so impressed with what is euphemistically termed his master's chatting with his wife and joking and doing what he required that he cried out. This poor dumb idiot underneath the master's bed cries out, "One would think that Abba's mouth had never before supped the cup." When his master, somewhat surprised to find his pupil under the marital bed, told him to get out because it is rude, Kahana's reply was also, "Master, it is Torah, and I need to know." Well, I read that humorous bit there because it really is quite funny. But the point is this is what we have in the Gospels. We've talked about this before. They are not biographies in a modern sense. They don't need to be. But they give us a life that is to be emulated. And that life has deeds and it has words. And the words comport with the deeds over and over and over again. In fact, the actual structure of at least two of the Gospels, Matthew and John, is written precisely that way. So we have this frame. We can now copy a human frame. We have this biography, the story of Jesus, who he is. There's that life, okay? And I want to bring up a text that Steph Miles brought to my attention. It's in the book by Tom Smale, Like Father, Like Son. And Steph had pointed this out, so I want to read it. I'm going to write down the wrong, page 59. He says, in regard to this business of imitation, now think about this. What I see the Father doing, I do. What I hear the Father saying, I say. This is Tom Smale writing on this. That Christ is both the prototypical divine imaging of God, in God and by God, and also the prototypical reflection of that divine image in our humanity, is confirmed in Hebrews, where the Son is said to be, quote, the reflection of God's glory and the exact imprint, and the Greek word there is character, the exact character of God's very being. And he sustains all things by his powerful word. Smale notes here. Here, character takes the place of icon in the Colossians passage, in Colossians 1, where Jesus is the icon of God, the image of God. Smale. The NRSV translation, exact imprint, does not quite do justice to the Greek because character is used both of the dye that is stamped to the wax and also of the imprint the dye makes on the wax to which it is applied. Jesus is the divine character. That is, he's both that which stamps and that which was stamped already by the Father. Thus, implicit in this verse is the idea that Christ is the divine prototype that is stamped onto our humanity and so imparts to it the divine image, and is also the human being who has received that image and is the perfect expression of it. In the rest of us, in our over-flexible human nature, that image has been eroded and distorted. But in Christ, it is fresh and new, authentic, and complete. If we weren't able to have this record of the life of Jesus, this story, this biography, we would have to make it up. We would absolutely have to make it up. The story of Jesus required telling. And I think the early Christian church understood this, particularly as the last witnesses were dying in the 60s under the reign of Nero. And there would have been an imperative then, like Papias, to seek out those who knew Jesus, to hear their stories, to find those that perhaps had collected their notebooks or taken notes or anything. From my memory, I go back to the 1980s when I sought out all Bonhoeffer students, as many as I could, to get handles on who Bonhoeffer was before they all died. One final text here comes from Michael Bird's book on the Gospel of the Lord, and the subtitle is How the Early Church Wrote the Story of Jesus. He talks about the Gospels as biographical kerygma, that is preaching, that is biographical, it's about Jesus, but it is a salvific, it's kerygmatic, it saves, it's a salvific biographical narrative. He says, the Gospels are the textual imprint of the oral phenomenon of Christian preaching and teaching about Jesus. I've picked this paragraph on purpose because of the use of that term imprint that we just talked about in Smale. That is, the Gospels are the textual imprint of the oral phenomenon of Christian preaching and teaching about Jesus. The Gospels give us a character. And that is, we see in the life of this figure from beginning to end in all four Gospels, even though there are manifold differences on many, many, many minor levels, on every level when it comes to Jesus' relationship to things like money, temple, religion, the reign of God, there's a consistency in his thinking on these subjects across the board in all the Gospels, even though there's going to be different halakhic maneuvers made between the Gospel traditions. Bird continues, viewed in this way, the Gospels are Christian documents related to the needs of Christians in corporate reading, worship, apologetics, and proclamation. I would drop apologetics, but that's Bird. So in this sense, they're a unique genre with no literary counterparts. The Gospels are a unique genre with no literary counterparts because the Gospels are telling the story of someone who is unique with no counterparts, and that's the story of the Lord Jesus. So if we are willing to move away from a Platonic anthropology, and we're no longer willing to talk about Jesus' humanity in the abstract, any more than we're willing to talk about our humanity in the abstract. If we have to talk about our humanness in terms of social relations, and so we too have to go back and use these tools in the Gospels, in Second Temple Judaism, to understand Jesus in his relationships to all these groups and types of persons that he encountered. If we're going to do this, if we're going to make this shift, what we're fundamentally doing is making the shift from Plato to Hillel. We're saying that anthropology, that is what it means to be human, cannot take its definition from philosophy or medicine or even evolutionary biology. I was thinking about this earlier this evening. If we take our definition of human from evolutionary biology, at which point do we talk about being human? Are we only talking about Homo sapiens? Are we not talking about other lines like the Denisovians or the Neanderthals? Do we leave out that part of us as a species that's not yet conscious? Do we only talk about ourselves as human, say, after the Upper Dryas Ice Age, and or do we talk about ourselves as human before that? What makes us human? Is it our minds? Is it language? All the things that the rationalists of the Enlightenment thought have fallen by the wayside. What makes us human is our idolatry. We are the species that is idolatrous. We seek to transcend ourselves. That's what makes us human, is our sin. And so it's important that Jesus is able to enter even into that. If we are going to shift our anthropology and recognize that it is all about relationships and relationality, that is, it's about an integrated worldview where everything is related. You cannot make statements about Christ that don't have an impact on your theory of the church or sin. You can't make statements about God that don't have an impact on your theory of the Spirit or discipleship. That is, everything is connected with everything else. If we are going to allow that shift to happen, we will have logos and myth will be dispelled. And we will have an anthropology that makes sense to us, where because we now have the freedom to follow, we have the freedom to choose to follow, we have the freedom to become apprentices in this business of the reign of God, the same way Jesus was an apprentice and learned. So we now have that. We imitate him. He's the first follower. We go into his dance. We dance his dance. Does that make sense to you? So even if we don't want to talk about ecclesiology because church today is meaningless, if we're going to talk Christological anthropology, we're always going to end up with ecclesia, because that's what a Christological anthropology looks like in the end. Ecclesia, a body working together by one Spirit. I'll leave that with you as we look forward to next week and we get very particular about the humanity of Jesus of Nazareth as we talk about Jesus the Jew.